To today's panel session on interdisciplinary perspectives on equity, fairness and bias. It actually follows nicely from our plenary session we've just had. It's a pleasure to bring together a wide range of people from affiliated in various ways to the Centre of Excellence of Automated Decision Making in Society, from junior scholars to senior scholars, and very grey scholars as well, and very bald ones as well. So the aim here is to just explore what these concepts of equity, fairness and bias might mean from different disciplinary perspectives, because part of the role of the centre is to draw together different disciplines to try to progress transparent, responsible and ethical automated decision making. And to do that, we really need these conversations to occur so that we can build that collective understanding. And I think this is the purpose of this panel. So what we're going to do for today in the structure of this panel is to firstly have about 5 minutes from each of the panel, and we should have Jackie Leach Scully joining us online, hopefully, as well. And then after those 5 minutes, I'll give about 5 minutes for questions or comments from the audience. And then what I'm going to do is actually put up 3 different case studies. And I'd like each of you in your groups to actually explore how would you go about making this this particular circumstance, or working through, well, how would we test whether this is fair or unbiased or equitable? So first of all, I'm going to go through the bios of all of our people, and then we'll talk. So first of all, I'm Paul Henman. I'm a professor at the University of Queensland in digital sociology and social policy, and my interest is in the way in which digital technologies are involved in government and their transformation of policy and power. We have Emmanuel Falkovic, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Economics and Finance at La Trobe University. Her current research interests deal with the quality of working life, of crowds workers, of platforms, neurodiversity, and the digital transformation of workplaces, inclusion, exclusion, and AI, and the impact of blockchain technologies on governance. And then we have Rakesh. Rakesh Kumar is a PhD student at the Western Sydney University and a PhD student of this centre. He researches platforms, labour market, entrepreneurship in Australia, and is interested in the future of work, particularly amongst migrants. He brings almost two decades of tech work experience to academia. So welcome. And then we have Jeffrey Chang. Jeffrey Chang is Associate Investigator of the Centre and Associate Professor of Machine Learning and Data, and a member of the Centre of Information Discovery and Data Analytics and the Centre for Industrial AI Research and Innovation at RMIT. His research interests are in machine learning, fairness, accountability, transparency, ethics in AI, recommender systems and their applications in many areas of industry. And then we have Scarlett Wilcock. Scarlett is a lecturer at the University of Sydney Law School. Her research focuses on the relationship between new technology and social services, law and administration. She uses critical approaches and empirical research methods to study the ways in which new technologies can reinforce, shape and or transform welfare policy and administration. And Jeannie Marie Peterson is a Professor of Law and Co-Director of the Centre for AI and Digital Ethics at the University of Melbourne. Jeannie's research focuses on consumer protection, banking and emerging technology law. And Jackie Leach Scully, hopefully joining us online, is Professor of Bioethics and Director of the Disability Innovation Institute at the University of New South Wales. Her research interests in bioethics have covered new and emerging technologies in genomic and reproductive medicine, global health, emergencies and disasters, and organ transplantation, generally with a focus on disability and taking feminist and empirical approaches. So I now hand over to Emmanuel.
Thank you, Paul. You can hear me? Yeah. So I'm delighted to participate to this panel. Thank you, and bring the economic perspective as a labor economist, and it's probably not representative of what we have in the discipline, and to highlight the notion of bias in economics, and also I'm coming from an applied background, so looking at bias in econometrics and statistics that I use, and I will flag some of my recent research results, more specifically on neurodiversity initiatives. In economics, the neutrality versus bias of technologies is well analyzed in the skill-biased technological change theory, SBTC, and skill-biased organizational change theories that try to explain the polarization on the labor market and the development of inequalities. Basically, in few words, this theory says that technologies generate a shock on the production functions that transform the production function, and the demand for different categories of workers will evolve. Some categories of workers will be favored, and some other categories will become unemployed or receive a lower wage. That's where we have a bias. When we talk about a neutral, this is a very deterministic approach, because basically technologies generate a transformation of the division of labor between machine and human, which generate inequalities. That's the determinism. If you think about a neutral algorithm, it's something different. A neutral algorithm is an algorithm that gives an accurate representation of the reality. And the reality on the labor market is general discrimination. In that way, we could consider that algorithms are encoding the diversity and inclusion crisis that we observe on the labor market, especially in the tech industry. So you can see here that we have a kind of loop that we want to end, which is a loop of discrimination. Diversity crisis on the labor markets leads to technologies that leads to diversity crisis on the labor market. So basically, how do we end the loop? And that's where the equity of an algorithm gives some ideas on how to do. And it's something different. It goes one step further, and it considers that an algorithm should be neutral for some categories protected by the law that we consider as discriminated or vulnerable. The question here is that it's fairness, which is going with equity, is something different from performance. It's not going with an accurate representation of the world as it is going. So I think there is, algorithms are not designed to be fair, but to be performance. So that's where we need to find incentives to change that. In econometrics, which is also my background, we have a long history in the analysis and of bias. We look at data bias, so I will use the term GIGO after, which is garbage in, garbage out. So if you have data that is biased initially, you will have an algorithm that is biased at the end. The question of omitted variables, endogeneity bias, selection bias, this is all what we analyze in econometrics when we try to test a relation or a model. In the few minutes I have remaining, I would like to highlight some of my results that I believe should be relevant to understand algorithmic bias in the recruitment. At the workplace, we are both in situation of productive interdependencies and social interactions. All my research for 2 decades now is showing that stereotypes are activated during social interactions, and after they will spread at the workplace through productive interdependencies, for example. So what does it mean for us? If an algorithm is relying on data that is the outcome of social interactions, or generated by social interaction, or encoding social interaction, it will activate the stereotype, which will generate a bias. So in the well-known example of Amazon that used in 2015 AI recruitment tool to sort CVs, women were systematically discriminated by the system. The explanation provided is, of course, related to the historical discrimination of women in the tech industry and, in this case, Amazon. But we need also to have in mind that CV is a kind of indirect social interaction between an employer and an employee, because that's the way the worker gives a narrative of its performance to the employer. So social interaction encoded in a CV means it will activate a bias. It will activate a stereotype that will generate a bias, so GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. I will have the same arguments about video recruitment. So all recruitment procedures using videos recording to evaluate candidates, it's more coding social interaction once again. So it's important in the evaluation of performance to separate the social interaction part from the performance part. I would invite researchers in IT to look at models of social interactions in economics and how they model the reflection, which is a peer effect in these stereotypes. And when it comes to recruitment, to separate the evaluation of the social interaction from the evaluation of performance, use technologies mainly to evaluate performance rather than social interaction. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Rakesh.
Yep. Thank you. Okay. So you want me to click?
Green button.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. Hi, everyone. My research covers the three intersecting fields of platforms, labor, and migration studies. I'm a PhD student at Western Sydney University. In a word, I would say it focuses on migrant platform work, specifically platform entrepreneurial work among Indian migrants in the food and wellness sectors. Here on this panel, I would be exploring bias as it relates to migrant platform work. Now, you can broadly divide migrant platform work into gig economic work and platform entrepreneurial work. There are, of course, connections and overlap between the two. Gig work is the familiar, precarious, exploitative work of Uber drivers and food delivery workers, while platform entrepreneurial work, which my PhD is focusing on, does work on a lot of legacy and emerging platforms and takes a blended offline and online approach, also called the creator economy or passion economy in some circles. Though I feel platform entrepreneurial work goes beyond these two monikers. Now, what are the sources of bias in migrant work? Of course, there's cultural bias, racism, language, ethnocentrism. General migrant bias, this is the general migrant bias, and it takes on a new potency when it relates to migrant work, which is exploitation, wage theft, discrimination. All of these are well known and studied. Then there's the credential bias and a colonial skill recognition system bias. So there's this blocked mobility thesis of scholars like Jim Collins, and it's a major reason why migrants are forced to set up small businesses in the host country, especially in ethnic food, etc. I want to also basically here touch on two particular kind of bias when it comes to gig migrant work. One is the union bias. The union bias is very important because a lot of focus has been on the reclassification of gig workers as employees and not independent contractors. Well, that is important. I think the focus has been so much that it has actually harmed the migrant gig economy workers, because these workers are temporary workers and they are not formally employed, and so the union does not represent them, and so it actually harms their welfare and does not do anything for their representation or exploitation. So while this focus on union thing, so I think the union bias for formal workers actually is affecting the migrant gig economy workers negatively. Also, there's this state and regulatory bias, because I think the state is kind of complicit in this managing migration kind of policy. So you have this temporary migration, and we are going to have a summit soon in Australia, Job and Skills Summit. And then, but they do nothing for the absorption of this low-wage workers in the economy. So the state actually talks about managing the migration in a way that all these migrants are pushed into low-wage work, and that's how the macroeconomic structure is managed. So what I would say is that there's a broader structural critique rather than just, I mean, of course, the platforms are to blame, and platform policies are exploitative, etc. But also migrants choose platform work, and we need to understand why migrants choose platform work. And I think there are 3 reasons why they choose platform migrant work. One is, of course, that they're socially, I mean, they're excluded from the employment sector. And secondly, they have, I mean, a lot of background checks, etc., that the formal sector does goes against migrants. The apps actually provide a lot of, in different languages, they provide, terms of use. You just click. You don't have to actually do a lot of signing of the offer letter, et cetera, et cetera. So while that might seem some indiscriminate, we have to accept that migrant or platform work is not going anywhere. And so we need to include all kinds of labor. I mean, the union, the state needs to include all kinds of labor, do some labor reform, and it's actually an intersection between the labor market, welfare reform, and the immigration policy that needs to be taken care of. Because migrants in migrant platform work, they occupy a unique positionality, and it's important to understand that. It's important why they take up this kind of work, and why they feel, flexibility or autonomy is important. Why they feel that this kind of work is actually providing them better income, because if you're excluding them from the formal sector, anyways, they will go for here. And there's so much of bias in the union, in the state, and apart from social bias, that they actually are. So at the same time, what I would say is that simultaneously, you can argue that platform work is degrading labor, which is like accepted, but it also provides opportunities to migrants and aspirations to migrants. And entrepreneurial work is a special manifestation of that, which is simultaneously, I mean, an extension of our a projection of the gig economy precarity and inequality of race, gender, and class. And at the same time, it is also providing opportunities and aspirations to the migrants. So it is like both, not either one, and we need to understand that before we can intervene in this area. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jeff.
Yep, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. So hi everyone, so I'm Jeff, Associate Professor at MIT. So I'll try to give a more technical perspective on fairness and bias in that my background is in machine learning, particularly designing some of these algorithms, but I have a very strong interest in fairness and bias, and basically how to improve the existing algorithms to incorporate more of fairness issues. So I want to touch on, and apologize for those that are very familiar with this already, kind of the general model that we think about when designing algorithms, particularly in terms of machine learning, right? So what we want to do is we want to design models that can extract out patterns and generalize from data, whatever the data means, right? And I'll use an example from the banking industry, but I equally could use a labor example like Emmanuel has talked about, or Rakesh, right? And I don't work for a bank, so the only association I have with a bank is I have a huge mortgage with them. Okay, so, but nothing else. So initially, what we usually do is we collect some data, right? And in the bank example, that could be customer information, and maybe the bank is interested in designing a model to predict the risk of extending a loan to a new customer, right, or existing customer, and so that will be the outcome, right? So what kind of biases can occur, right? And I'll talk about the different biases in each of the three parts. So that's why I put up this figure. And these are not just the only biases there are. As Emmanuel Rakesh touched on already, there's lots and lots of different biases, but just want to highlight a few to get I guess some thinking considerations going. First, in terms of this historical bias, in that the data that we have collected and built our models on may, the data itself, right, is a reflection of society, right, and society has all these historical biases, right. So, for example, in the loan example, maybe the bank has previously lended to a high demographic Caucasians, right, and it's under-reflective in terms of minorities, right, and so that's the true historical bias there, right, in terms of what's previously occurred. Then there could be representational biases, right, in that we collect the data, but the data itself may not actually represent what we actually want to model on, right? So, for example, going back to the banking example, we might have collected lots of data about customers in the Asia in Australia, right? But we might want to extend the system to say Asian Pacific context, right? And it's underrepresented again in terms of the say East Asian customers. So there's kind of representational bias there. I'll move on. So in the interest of time, so. Then we have the model, right? And this is model algorithm, right? So this is where the learning occurs. And again, there's lots of different types of biases here, right? And what we mean by algorithm bias is essentially the model, the algorithm design is generally optimized for predicting the output as well as possible based on our data, right? And it encapsulates a lot of the design and thought processes of the organization or the engineers that built this, right? But of course, with any algorithm, right, with any design, the design itself would inject some kind of bias in there, and there's lots of things that are included in algorithms. So as I said, the trying to get as accurate as possible. You could include different fairness notions. You could try to make the models to be able to generalize as best as well as possible. But there's a trade-off between anything that you include, right? As in you can't optimize your algorithm for all the possible criteria. Okay, so there's definitely algorithm bias. That's something that's problematic. There's things like bias, right? So this is where, because a lot of the time we're looking at statistics and looking at the general patterns, right? Then we might, because of that, kind of ignore or not consider subgroups. So going back to the banking example, so or even in this audience, right? So I think roughly we're about half and half in terms of gender, okay? So if I say, look, it seems like we have a very even proportion of gender here, which is fantastic, right? But in computer science, or kind of a lot of the STEM areas, there's unfortunately, there's still a dominance of males there, right? And if I just use this example, right, in terms of gender, right, then I'll be missing out on saying, look, in computer science, there's still kind of a gender imbalance. So that's a kind of an aggregation bias in terms of aggregation across the data, so that you missed out on the subtle differences. And finally, in terms of the prediction outputs, you could be evaluating based on, the data you learn on is different from the data that you want to predict or evaluate on. And a classical example of this is that, maybe the data you use in the banking prediction system is old data, as in you look at the whole lifetime history of your existing customers, and maybe when they're young they did a lot of things that they should have done, right, as if most of us here. But later on in life they actually have a much better credit history. But if you look at the history of when they're younger years, then there's a kind of disparity between the data you learn on and the data that you use to actually do the prediction. Okay, so. Yeah, 1 minute. Okay, so just very quickly, right? So what can be done, right? Basically, you could what's called pre-processing. So you can try to fix up the bias in the data. In processing, so designing your algorithms to incorporate different different notions of fairness to try to balance that. And post-processing is try to look. These are the results. I'm going to try to make them more fair, right? And each of those have issues, but I'll be happy to answer questions about those. So basically, there's a number of issues here. So one is statistical bias, which is in machine learning, basically trying to get your algorithm as accurate as possible in terms of the existing data. And then the prejudice bias is all the different biases to talk about. And there's usually a conflict here. So I touched on that before. There's individual versus group fairness. So in individual fairness, we want similar individuals to be treated equally. In group fairness, we want different disparate groups to be treated equally. And again, there's a conflict there occasionally. And then, there's lots and lots of notions of fairness. Like which one do we optimize for? Because we can't optimize them all, right? So basically, this is a difficult problem. Have multiple stakeholders and multiple objectives, conflicting objectives. Okay, so the final slide, I promise. So basically want to say this is not there's no technical solution to this in that, I can design all kinds of algorithms with different fairness measures, right? But as you can see, it's a trade-off. And, I encourage you to think about, if you're in the kind of machine learning space about, extending out and working with, colleagues here to try to, incorporate those, basically have a discussion and think about what is most important in terms of when design these algorithms and systems. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So thanks very much for that. What I hope to talk about fairly briefly in this very short period of time that's been given is just to very briefly introduce some concepts that might be relevant to fairness and a focus on fairness from administrative law that apply to administrative decision making by public entities. So think refugee, migration law, taxation, social security law, all sorts of government decisions. Most of what I'm talking about derives from the common law, so whilst it's primarily focused on Australian principles, these are not only in Australia. So think of where the British colonised, and you'll find something, especially in the white settler colonies, something similar, sometimes quite expanded sometimes, or what have you. So when we look at administrative law, the most obvious doctrine relating to fairness is that of procedural fairness, and that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about. Apologies to the recovering lawyers amongst us. This could be a little bit of a refresher for you, but in fact, I was an administrative lawyer, and I had to do a refresher because sometimes these principles don't come up in our everyday work, or it's good to revisit them in different contexts. So I did actually have to go to the library and get my old admin law textbooks out to give me to make sure I was on the right track. Certainly other rules and doctrines other than procedural fairness have a bearing on fairness. And I'm thinking even really fundamentally that a decision must be within the law and the decision maker must have lawful authority, etc. So those obviously have a bearing. So this is not it. But again, I'm going to focus on procedural fairness because I think it has, it's the most obvious fit here. And before I launch into just a little bit about the specifics of those requirements, I want to reflect on whether or not procedural fairness has, or administrative law more generally, has anything to offer in the way of substantive fairness. And my initial reaction is not really. But there are some, in the sense that, well, first of all, the process itself can be worse in some decisions. So we think of, if anyone remembers Malcolm Feely's The Process, the Punishment, etc. Fair processes can prevent or certain types of unfair decisions, substantively unfair decisions. There are some other doctrines like reasonableness, which might engage with fairness of the decision, the sort of substantive fairness more directly. So it might, prevent manifestly arbitrary decisions, for example, although there's still quite an open door for, slightly unreasonable decisions in the way. So there is some bearing, but do I think that these principles are going to create fair decisions on their own without other instruments of accountability and fairness? Absolutely not. And that's why we need to all sit here together. So I see this as a kind of, often these principles are silent and explicitly avoid questions of substantive fairness. That's for the lawmakers or what have you, or that's for the policymakers, not for, administrative law per se. So, especially when it comes to redistribution, we'll shy away from questions about that. Nonetheless, administrative law and particularly procedural fairness, these are currently existing requirements. Okay, these are not, principles of, they have some potential to limit and regulate government decisions, including those assisted or made by advanced technical systems. And I think that shouldn't be completely overlooked. They're nonetheless a narrow system of limiting that kind of state power. So, procedural fairness. What does it include? Of course, you could do you could do a PhD on it or more, but just in a kind of rough way, its application, what I'm talking about here is it applies to decisions made by government bodies of a public character when an individual's rights or interests and sometimes legitimate expectations are at stake. So it's obviously going to apply to things like Centrelink decisions about granting, cancelling a payment, making a debt, migration decisions, etc. It also can apply to some sort of decisions by non-government entities of a public character, so trade unions, sporting organisations, even churches, that kind of thing. That's where it's kind of, that's its application. But of course, if you think anyone dealing with public bodies, so that's especially public bodies that make decisions that affect interests, that's where it's, the heartland, if you like. In terms of what it entails, well, it's actually got sort of two core components, procedural fairness requirements. The first is the bias rule. And so basically, this covers both perceived and actual bias, so that the decision makers are not nor appear to be biased. Actual bias the cases on that are incredibly rare because perceived bias is far more easy to demonstrate. And it's a possibility that the decision might not be impartial. And what this assumes, and you can see how it might not fit well with sort of ADM systems, is a single impartial decision maker that comes at a decision with an open mind. Okay, I also quite try to frequently remind my black letter administrative law colleagues that didn't happen before new tech. It's in theory, but nonetheless, this is a basis to sort of challenge decisions. And the bias here is primarily focused, or at least best at capturing and challenge bias of a kind of very limited types of bias. So we're talking about sort of financial or pecuniary, non-financial interests that the decision maker has in the decision, or they've been involved in an earlier process. Does it capture institutional bias? Incredibly rarely, and in very incredibly small amount of circumstances. There's limitations here and potential, I guess. And just on that second one, the hearing rule, It's about, the thrust of this is that the affected party, the affected person has an opportunity to advance their case, and that might require sort of prior notice that the decision's being made, that the allegations are put to them, or they understand the critical issues, and some kind of hearing, whether that's providing submissions or, it can be anything from, a couple of sentences to a full-on quasi-judicial hearing. However, the kind of thing is procedural fairness in these administrative settings is very much almost always applies except if there's statutory exclusion. However, what is actually required is based on the circumstances. So there's a kind of a key case that says that actually these are what's actually required to fulfill procedural fairness requirements is, it's a practical or flexible obligation that depends on circumstances. And this particularly affects the hearing rule. So it may mean that lower level or standardised decision making, especially where there's a right of appeal or review that's internal, the hearing rule, yes, there's procedural fairness requirements required, but the hearing rule virtually disappears. And you might just have to be notified that the decision's been made afterwards, right? So what actually is required to fulfil these standards depends on context, the type of decision, the interests affected. So yes, they generally apply. What the content of those is really context specific. So in terms of, that's kind of a brief overview of those kinds of things. I just wanted to highlight this. I'm not going to go into it. I think these are something in the coming up. You can see, I think there is some potential here to advance and certainly to expand existing doctrines. There is potential for regulation and limiting decision-making in public settings that involve ADM. But, there are obvious limitations and sort of failures to there's a failure to reconcile the two kind of things when you've got these systems. And one thing I'll just say is that, so if we just, that was really helpful to have that sort of machine learning process of, data, model, etc. Well, the ideal administrative process assumes an entirely different linear process of decision making. So it assumes here's an individual that we pluck from the sky who comes to the decision with an open mind, they're impartial and independent, then they gather the evidence, then they only consider relevant factors and not irrelevant factors, they apply their mind, make a judgment, and come to a decision. Now, of course, ADM can subvert that linear process, and these doctrines have been developed with that kind of process in mind, so they don't always fit together. And so there's some kind of, there's certainly some work to do to make them work, because we already know that this is already happening in administrative contexts where ADM's already infiltrated, that seems quite a loaded word, but involved in those processes. And the level of incompatibility depends where that system fits. So is it replacing, or is it assisting? Is it gathering evidence? Is it just organising evidence, or is it recommending, etc.? And those, sort of raise different challenges for these doctrines, which are nonetheless requirements. And that's where I'll leave it there. So I'm happy to talk more about these different sort of limitations later if required. Thanks.
I have to stand up because I can't stand still when I'm talking, I'm afraid. So I just have to walk around. I'm just going to speak to these points on the screen, but I'm in the fortunate position that the previous speakers have set up a lot of the issues that I was going to touch on, so hopefully I'll stay within my allowed time. So I'm going to talk about algorithmic bias and consumer protection law. Now, consumers are subject to automated decision-making in the private sector. So this might be decisions about employment, about whether they get a loan, whether they get insurance. Consumers are also subject to automated decision-making and potentially bias in their retail encounters. So they may be subject to targeted advertising that is premised on decisions about different groups of consumers. Different groups of consumers may see different ads. They may be subject to the use of new technologies that are being used in retail environments, so facial recognition technology, which has come to light recently through the work of Choice and the Centre for Automated Decision decision making. We know that facial recognition technology is, at this stage anyway, very biased against who and what it recognises. And consumers may be purchasing technologies that use automated decision making, which may also be subject to implicit bias. Consumers may be purchasing services that help them make decisions about what products they buy. They may be using technologies in their homes about how to regulate their homes, and they may be subject to implicit biases here. So what sort of recommendations they get about what food they might like, or what TV shows they might want to watch, or even how hot their house should be or otherwise. So I'm interested in the ways these biases can manifest in the consumer context, where we don't have administrative law, or indeed in some contexts much experience with human rights law in monitoring and scrutinising these biases. So we've heard already that algorithmic bias can arise from a variety of sources, including decisions about what kind of data is collected, how that data is processed, who's in the data, who's not in the data, and so on. So I won't talk about that otherwise than say that the consequences are catastrophic and widespread. Now, I'd suggest that consumer protection law is quite well adapted to responding of problems of unfairness or bias or discrimination in those various contexts I've mentioned, be it decisions about consumers, consumers' interactions with technology that's being used in stores, or indeed in the products consumers buy. So that the Federal Trade Commission in the US has said that it will use its fairness jurisdiction to in fact respond to consumer products that have implicit biases in them. And we have similar powers here that are available to our regulators. So the ACCC has power to scrutinise consumer interactions for being misleading or unconscionable, which I'd suggest could catch products or decisions that are premised on embedded bias in the systems that are being used. And of course, ASIC, which is the financial regulator, has a power to respond to unfair decisions in consumer credit markets. And indeed, anybody who's a financial service provider is required to make decisions that are efficient, honest and fair. But the problem, I'd suggest, is a practical one. Bias in automated decision making can be difficult to identify. So we know that individual decision makers are often biased, they often discriminate, they're often full of prejudice. But what automated decision making or algorithmic bias does is it amplifies that discrimination, because the whole purpose of automating decisions is that they can be made really quickly and efficiently and without necessarily a whole lot of human oversight. So we have amplification of human decision making bias, but it's very difficult to pick up. Because the other thing that automated decision making does is it's personalised. It's a decision for each individual. So if one person isn't seeing, for example, particular advertisements because of some decision about their identity or other protected attributes, they're not going to know that because they're only seeing what's before them. Somebody whose loan application is rejected because of a protected attribute is not going to know that because they don't know who else has been accepted. And we have the problems of opacity and proxies. No decision about who gets a loan or who gets to see particular ads or who gets insurance is going to be made directly on the basis of a protected attribute. The bank is not going to say, you don't get a loan because you're not white, you don't get a loan because you're not middle class. There's going to be other bases for that decision, which are maybe proxies for protected attributes, but are going to be quite difficult to pick up. Because what we know is when we're looking at large data sets, those large data sets, the machine learning models that have been spoken about, aren't necessarily looking for gender or race. What they're looking for other things, but those other things may be proxies for those factors. So what do? Often it's said, well, we need to have a human decision maker overseeing the process. And I'd suggest to you that those factors that I've just mentioned mean that a human decision maker isn't going to be useful at all. Because how's a human decision maker going to see through that mass of data or the use of proxy factors and so on? So I think we come closer to needing something along the lines of mandated, systematic testing, oversight and auditing of automated decision-making systems, which is not a long shot to require. We can have statistical processes that can help us identify at least bias or unfair patterns in the data. The problem then is, what do we do? Because as I think all of us speakers has mentioned, the problem to overcoming unfairness or bias in algorithmic decision-making system is not a mathematical or a statistical problem. It's a problem of deciding, as a matter of social policy, what factors are and are not acceptable to make decisions, to decide what ads people see, who gets the loan, what price the insurance is. Now, if people have been systematically and historically excluded from those decisions, so, for example, refugee communities haven't been given loans, women haven't got certain kinds of jobs, and so on, how do we create new factors that can make decisions that are less unfair, that don't amplify existing discrimination and inequality? We've got to come up with new factors. But and one possibility is that we use data to help us make those decisions. So we use data to find other types of factors that tell us who's a good credit risk, who should get insurance and the like. But the problem with that solution I'd put for you is it involves a huge amount of datafication. We're going to end up with credit scoring even in the pursuit of achieving better, fairer outcomes. And I think that's the dilemma that consumer protection law is going to have to deal with. And that's all for me.
Thank you very much. Do we have Jackie online? Okay.
We do.
Thanks,
Can you hear me?
The screen? You mean the slides?
Hi, just checking. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay.
Thank you, Jackie.
Okay, right. Thank you. It has been great to be listening in on other people, even from a long way away, to my disappointment. And I hope this will contribute to the rest of the discussion. I'm coming from a background as a bioethicist with a science background. I've got an interest in disability, and my work at the centre has been focusing on the socio-ethical implications of the use of ADM by and for people with disability. Now, ever since I started working in this area, I've been really intrigued by the focus, which we've been seeing today, of what we call AI ethics on fairness. Because in philosophical ethics, at least, it's usual to talk of justice, and actually very uncommon to talk of fairness, except as a kind of a subsidiary of justice. And I think the main reason why this happens in ADM and AI is because of what we've been hearing about, the anxiety, the rightful anxiety about algorithmic bias. Now, fairness, again, as we've heard, is generally taken to mean something like treating people equally in a way that's impartial and in a way that's free from bias. And this might be what we want to aim for in algorithmic decision making. And we've been hearing really good summaries of the different kinds of algorithmic bias and issues of algorithmic bias in the source data or in the processes themselves, with respect to certain populations or certain individuals within populations. In ethical theory, there are several models of justice that are considered to be more or less appropriate for different kinds of situation or different kinds of problem. Things like distributive justice, procedural justice, retributive justice, restorative justice, and then justice as fairness, which is one aspect, justice as equal resourcing, etc., etc. They all share sort of core ideas, which is that justice is not just about treating people impartially. So it's connected to broader concepts of, and this is where we get a little bit more amorphous, perhaps frustratingly so, concepts of what is right and good in society, concepts of giving to a person or a group what they deserve, giving people what is their due. And that might be, we tend to think in terms of benefits, but it might also be in terms of burdens, what people are due in benefits and what they are due in burdens. Justice also has a sort of a much more obligatory tang to it, obligatory force than maybe fairness. So it's something that that has to be done, that you have an obligation to strive for and to provide. And in most views, it also has an element of agency. So something or someone caused this unjust situation. And because of that, it's possible to undo, to rectify that unjust situation, because it is a matter of agency. It's not like a meteor falling out of the sky and killing you. That might be tragic, let's say more or less tragic, depending on who you are. But it's not unjust because there's no agent involved in kind of directing it at you. I think justice is better than fairness at encompassing more complex ideas about the right way to run the world, or make it better. So, for example, it takes in the idea that inequality or unfairness may on occasion be just if what it's doing is benefiting the historically most advantaged. So you're redressing an existing wrong by deliberately applying a form of unfairness. One of the key dilemmas in philosophical ideas about justice too is about how much particularity and detail and empirical stuff to bring in. So some philosophers like John Rawls, who wrote Justice as Fairness, has been very influential, argue that to determine what justice requires, we need to abstract as much away from real life conditions as we possibly can in order to get a kind of ideal overview of where we're aiming for. Others say that we need historical and political knowledge to dismantle racist or sexist or ableist or classist institutions and ensure that whatever new systems we're setting up don't just enshrine those same ableist and classist, etc., biases or injustices. And I think more philosophers today than in the past would be arguing that real-world institutions and real-world practices are unjust. And in order to put that right, then as well as perhaps having a background idea of the ideal and where we're aiming to get to, we need to pay attention to how differently situated people are experiencing oppression or discrimination, rather than sort of pretending they aren't there, which is what abstraction does. So, I mean, if we want our ADM systems to be just in the sense of producing a more just world, then rather than simply, we want to be doing something more than reproducing the injustices of the external world in the internal processes. So if we think that fairness is part of justice, but it's far from the whole story, then I think we probably have to accept that it will often, perhaps even always, be impossible to devise algorithms or algorithmic systems that generate genuinely just decisions, whether that's because of data constraints or whatever it is that needs to be taken into account for the ADM to be just, isn't mathematically or statistically representable. So, for example, and an example I used before because it comes from my current work with the Centre, contemporary models of disability tend to view it as a relational rather than a categorical phenomenon. And I think algorithmic systems tend not to handle relational phenomena very well. They're much better at handling binary categorization. So this, among other things, suggests that in many cases, a just ADM system is not going to work well of itself. It is going to require human algorithm alliances of some kind. There's a quote from Valadvala et al. Saying, a commitment to justice in AI involves remaining open to the possibility that sometimes a purely AI-oriented approach might not be a just one. Now, I think everybody in this room will probably understand and buy into that one and take on board about the limits of what the systems can do. The problem, I think, is people outside this room, if I can put it like that, but the people who will be buying the kit or the policymakers who will be integrating particular ADM processes into the implementation of policy. Because I think to some extent they have, and perhaps all of us have to an extent, a fantasy. And it's that technological fixed fantasy that human societies very, very often fall into, which is that this new piece of tech, this new piece of kit is just what we need to make everything better again, to rectify injustice in the outside world, to to bring about heaven on earth. And I think we have to be realistic enough to know that that's not the case with ADM, and to begin and be telling people in the world outside that very plainly and as transparently as possible. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jackie. Thank you. So I'm going to finish up with talking about the ideas of bias, fairness, and equity from social policy perspective. And I wanted to just begin and reflect, because in social policy it's often about the outcomes and the sense of what we're trying to achieve rather than the process. Now, everyone with any small children will know that a child will say, but that's not fair, and that underpins this concept of social policy quite often. And so there is some slippage that we see through the concepts of unfairness, discrimination, bias, and even difference. On the right-hand side, I've got 3 examples here. The first one is the example of the Queensland flood in 2011. The Queensland government decided to give grants to people who were uninsured to help them recover. Other people said that was not fair because they didn't take responsibility and get in insurance. The second one I've got there is Barbie dolls. And you think about the way in which Amazon or an online retailer might target a different type Barbie dolls to different participants. There is a difference in who they might target to. When is it fair? When is it not fair? When is it biased? When is it not biased? And the third example there I give is the example of health triage. And if examples of the giving of prioritising lung transplants. Government doctors make decisions about who they will prioritise. There's a bias in there, but how do we know when that issue is biased or fair? So when we talk about social policy, there are a lot of that fairness relates to the concepts of justice, as Jackie was talking about. And there are different ways in which we may think about what is fair and just. One is on the basis of need. So we talk about the focus of providing the social support for those in need in terms of poverty or deprivation, or those with additional needs, such as those having raising children or those with a disability. And also need in terms of risk. Are you at risk of long-term employment, or are you at risk of recidivism? The other one is like the idea of desert or just desert, or deservingness. So often, constantly, we've had through history the idea of undeserving and the deserving poor. The deservingness in terms of blame versus responsibility. And our insurance in our car systems are based on no-fault insurance often, but there is also fault insurance in Queensland. There's also the idea of just and deserving in terms of meritocracy and also in the market. And the final thing is about what justice is just and fair can be based on the idea of rights, whether they're universal rights or seen as rights embedded within a state, but rights are always a claim on the state. So that speaks to some of the things around about the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. But when we talk about the process as well, and this is again, some of what is fair relates to, well, what do we expect to be fair? What is the process in place that occurs it? So Jerry Mayshaw wrote in a book, Bureaucratic Justice, identified 3 different types of ways in which justice occurred. He distinguished between bureaucratic justice or administrative justice, professional justice, and I can't remember what the other one is. What was it? Sorry, legal justice. And all of them have different rules and processes. And Michael Adler has since extended that with 3 other ones. So all of those speak to the different rules by which outcomes occur, and that speaks to the difference between procedural fairness and substantive fairness. And I just want to close up with the final comment is that I noticed that even though we had the word equity, very few discussion has occurred about equality and equity. And typically we think about the difference between equity in terms of the need to treat people differently to achieve equal outcomes. Or what? So that's the panel at the moment. What I want to do is just open for 5 minutes, brief questions or comments, and then I've got 3 different discussion points that I want to break up in each of the small groups. So any questions or comments from the floor for any of the speakers? So we've got a roving microphone.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just going to pick up on the point you just made, Paul, that nobody actually talked about equity. So I'd like to hear what the panel think about equity in relation to fairness and equality. Because to me, as a social worker, equity is something very different. Yeah. But how does that fit with algorithmic processes?
Do you want me to start? So if you think about lending decisions, it's a really good question, because I think the equity question is really relevant to how we make the policy decisions about our response to concerns about algorithmic bias, or indeed the application of automated decision-making systems. So often those systems are deployed in ways that have the most impact on the people who are least able to protect their own interests. So whether you talk about it in government or in the private sector, often people who were already marginalised and excluded are the people whose marginalisation is amplified by an automated process. Now, I'd suggest that if we want to change that, that's a policy decision, but it's a policy decision that's premised on ideas of equity, of treating people fairly, and of addressing systematic exclusion and disadvantage, because systematic exclusion and disadvantage are choices that the society makes. They're not conditions that are inherent in the people that are subject to those biased or discriminatory decisions. So that would be a lawyer's perspective. But.
Anyone else want to comment?
If I think about equity, I would think about it in terms of barriers to access to what we want to access. And in a kind of bias is a kind of new barrier to access that we need to remove, and this barrier to access will not appear with the same probability to everyone. So I'm not sure it's helping, but yeah, that's the way I think about equity in terms of barriers to access.
In my case, I think migrants, when they're doing platform work, and platform work is mostly done by migrants. I mean, if you have noticed, in developed countries at least. So they need to be recognized. This kind of work needs to be recognized by the state and unions far more, rather than just saying, okay, that is not proper work, that is exploitative work, etc., etc. Because we know that even formal work, this low-paid formal work can be exploitative and have less dignity. So it's not that the distinction between formal work and informal work is going to result in. So for the sake of equity amongst migrants, I think the policy changes or the way the labor market, the legal status of labor workers needs to be relooked at. I think and because employment is at the end a legal and political arrangement, and I think it's very important that in the case of migrant platform work, the changes are made rather than just say that, oh, we should reclassify them as employees, or we should do that, or we should do that. I mean, so we have to take into account the realities and work accordingly.
Any other comments?
I wondered if I could jump in
I just want to, I mean, I don't have anything to add, but I think it is, equity bias. It is really something like a societal kind of discussion and decision. So it's not really a technical thing. So I see it as a additional objective that we have to look at, and it's kind of conflicting with some of the notions of bias and fairness that we discussed before. So there's, what I'm saying, there's no right or wrong answer. So it's more like a societal discussion.
Any other questions?
Sorry, could I jump in here?
Who was that?
Jackie.
Sorry, Jackie.
Yeah, it's okay. Sorry, I'm on a little screen and kind of, doing this stuff. I think, again, I'm going to get a bit conceptual here maybe and just say, when we're having these conversations, and again, possibly more with people outside this room than inside it, really careful and really important to be sure that whether we're talking about equality or equity, because a lot of people will use the two interchangeably or slide from one to the other. And it is very much connected with whether we're talking about fairness as traditionally understood or about justice. In that, if we're talking about equality, that's much more about making sure that everybody has the same stuff. And equity is much more about ensuring that everybody has the stuff they need to arrive at the same place. And which is something more to do with justice. And if we're not clear which one we're talking about or what we're reading about or what somebody else is talking about, then I think that's a problem.
Jackie, can you see us? Can you see the room? No.
I can't see the room. No.
Okay, so we're giving you a big clap.
Thank you.
There was another question. Someone.
Extremely brief. The point that Scarlett made about perceived bias in administrative law. So bias can exist also if people perceive that there is bias. And given the monoculture that exists in artificial intelligence, at some point, the people developing the systems that we're going to be assessing the bias are going to be using systems that are developed by the same companies. So Amazon is going to be storing the data from the government, and at the same time, in a procurement that they need, it's going to be there. Or whatever you can think of, Google. And is that perceived bias, can you use that for artificial intelligence? Because the relations are still between the company that is part of the evaluating the bias is going to be involved in the bias, but the system itself might not be biased. So how do you see that playing out?
Listen, I think that there is possibilities, although it's not an area I've looked at. Some of the other scholars say, listen, the bias rule is just going to, like, it's no hope, we've got to look elsewhere. Because one of the things is kind of, and I was just talking to Paul about this, in some ways, the more sort of entrenched the bias is and more systematic, and the further it away from the actual decision, the less likely administrative law is going to be able to help. So in that sense, it's much better at capturing like that proximity, like so the decision maker with a personal or financial interest. So already. And you can see how it doesn't capture, leaving aside automated decision making, it doesn't really capture sort of institutional bias that well anyway, that might just be in a department, like an administrative department. There is, I think, with private aspects or privatized aspects, more potential, because you can see like perceived bias, there's possibility. The doctrine would have to be developed, so it's not really there. But currently, so for the area that I know most about, which is social security law, a lot of it is in-house. So it's all the data they keep. They still are very, their models are developed in-house. They might buy off-the-shelf software or whatever, but there's less sort of private. That said, employment services is different. So that's the one where it's a lot of private hands involved, which may hold more potential. Not there yet, I guess, is a simple answer. But there is, we could push that doctrine of perceived bias, because it's, a possibility, that a reasonable bystander, if you like, would perceive,
the possibility that the bias would be impartial. So if you've got clear private conflicting interests, that could be a basis for a challenge, for example.
Any other comments? I don't want any more questions because I want to break into small groups. Did anyone want to comment on the panel?
One.
I think there was one up the back.
Sorry? We've got till 1:15, right? Is that right? I thought it was 12. I was told 1:15 we had to go. No? To 12. Oh, okay. All right. Well, we probably have to bring it to a close. Thank you, everyone, for contributing. I think we've had a wonderful conversation here. I think what we can evident is that words bias. We do have 12:15. Okay. All right. So can we put these slides back on then? So what I want to do now is, because I think that what we've been working through is like the concept of bias is doing a lot of work in different areas. And I wanted, and we talk about the problems that occur in, I want to get down to some examples to go like, well, how do we work through questions of bias, of fairness and examples? And I'm going to give each table, table 1, table 2, table 3, table 1, table 2, table 3. I want each of you to do the example that I've got up on the board and say, well, how would we work out what we're trying to aim at, which it isn't when it isn't unbiased, or when does bias occur, when does bias not occur in each of those 3 examples. And I want to give about 5 minutes to each of you on the tables, and then we come back together to see what your brains together have come up with from that. Exploring using some of the different languages, the different concepts that we've heard from today. Does that understand? Good. Okay, thank you. Hey, can we come back to a group? Can we come back to a group? Thank you, everyone, for those discussions. We've only got 5 minutes. Would any of the tables like to share with the rest of the group what your thinking was about your case study? So we have the roving mic around. Thanks, Sally. Any volunteers? I can see Jeff running away quickly. Any table want to volunteer how they address the questions in their particular table? No volunteers?
Should I just choose one?
Come on.
This table.
Thanks, Sally.
Yeah.
We were dealing with example 3, and it was interesting that we had the discussion about the difference between fairness, bias, equity, and discrimination. We sort of had a sense that there's a Venn diagram and they all intersect at a certain point. A person can be subject to unfairness, discrimination, bias, and inequity all at the same time. The example that we thought of as an inequity would be if that technology were being used to allocate resources as a policy matter, not in relation to individual decisions. It would be inequitable as between that community and other subpopulations that might need the resources more. On the other hand, if that incorrect risk assessment were resulting in, for example, a loan denial to a member of that subpopulation, that would be discriminatory, biased, unfair, and inequitable in the systemic sense that community is also suffering from other disadvantages. So we were just kind of exploring the different ways in which where on the spectrum between those different kinds of broadly unfairness the particular system might lie depending on context. That was the heart of our discussion.
Thanks very much, Henry. And I have to say that's actually an example that I'm aware of from a former student of mine, that there was a Kanak, and she was categorised as long-term and unemployed because Kanaks are regarded as the same as Indigenous, and she was treated as a long-term unemployed even though she had a university entry, start at university. Any other tables? And I do hope that we can collect some of the what you've written, so we'll perhaps write it up. And you haven't written anything. Any other tables? You're also question 3, aren't you?
Yes.
Yeah.
I just thought it might be interesting because we had a bit of a different approach to question 3. which is kind of, I don't know, cool because everyone's doing it differently. We ended up speaking a lot about the purpose that the algorithm was being used for the same way that table over there did. So for example, we compared if it was perhaps being used for welfare purposes, that might be different to if it's being used for like insurance purposes to, deny people unemployment insurance or things like that. Whereas for welfare, it could be a positive impact. We also spoke about what we ended up looking at in the end was realizing we could kind of categorize the different things into the input, processing and output stages. So we also spoke a lot about the flow-on effects of not just direct impacts, but the flow-on effects of potentially categorizing a group as being more at risk of long-term unemployed and the social perceptions around that. And we also spoke a little bit about how it depends on the status of the population, because all we've really got there is minority Australian subpopulation. So it depends whether that is a sort of historically marginalised group, or we use the example of billionaires are technically a minority population in Australia, but potentially discriminating against them isn't that bad. Yes, they were some of the things. I don't know, does anyone else have any other things we spoke about?
That's great. Thank you very much. We got an example from 2 or 1. Any?
There you
go. I see a lot of finger pointing going on there.
Yeah. We have reflected our agreement in the paper, which is white. So, so pretty much the starting point. Yeah. The starting point is, why would the government even invest in algorithm for prediction of recidivism when police matters in that context? Could be money, could be better invested somewhere else. So that was the starting point. Then we look at the technical possibilities, and we thought, well, if you are not using the variable that you are coming from an indigenous or non-indigenous, if you are not using the variable, but the outputs are that is overrepresenting indigenous people as potential offenders, then you might, and that was the technical suggestion, meddle with the outputs so you can adjust so there's no such as an overrepresentation of indigenous people. And then, well, something that probably Henry knows quite well as well, this actually comes from, it does exist in other places, in Spain and in the UK exist this type of systems. And the problem is that what you're trading is the rights of the potential reoffender with the protection of the rights of the offended party. So actually, if you start meddling with the outputs, you might be underprotecting victims of domestic violence. So if you have not used the variable indigenous, but you are still overrepresenting indigenous at the end, then maybe that because they are actually part of the population because of other socio-demographic elements, that they are actually more likely to be in the recidivism. And you would say, well, that's wrong, but you also have to look at the rights of the women that you're trying to protect, or men, depending on the legislation, in cases of domestic violence. So meddling with outputs may be problematic. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Anyone from a table 1? We've got one table here, one. Oh, well, we've got a volunteer, thank you.
So we can earn our lunch. So we look at the Amazon recommendations scenario, and we mainly discuss factors that might influence unfair or discriminatory outcomes. So we started thinking about the price, so having equally relevant items but with different prices, and you might have an unfair or discriminatory outcome there. We thought about also the relation between price and other factors in terms of quality or ways of how those products were manufactured, and might be problems in that as well. We look at the content, item, provider availability and exposure, and how do you guarantee or measure how the exposure of different items or different group of items are exposed to different users. We looked at the relation of that on problems that might happen when you categorize, no? How do you define that this set of products are different from this other set of products, or how do you define subpopulations? And finally, we look at the things that might happen because of the reinforcements of stereotypes of using logs or behavioral data in the platform.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
I know it's lunchtime now, so I want to just close up, but thank you very much for all your contributions to our panel and to our audience. I think one of the things that comes through to me is the really significant lots of questions that are involved in asking the context, what the purpose of the things are, to actually get to an answer about is this fair or not. And so when we're looking at the whole level of bias or fairness or equality as the principle, we can all agree to that. Then when you go down to the enacting it, that this is where the challenges lie. And I think that's where we, in the Centre of Excellence, that we need to move more into that conversation about unpacking and distilling and helping guide community in those things. So thank you very much to the panellists. I really appreciate all of your thoughts, interdisciplinary contributions. And realise, showing us how these concepts do different work in different disciplines, which is really, really valuable, but at the same time it creates a lot of confusion, and so these conversations are really important. So thank you very much for all of you.